It had been years since the doors of the abandoned mental hospital had been opened. The building stood tall and imposing, its brick facade weathered by time and neglect. Few people in the small town even knew it existed, and those who did were warned to stay far away. There were rumors that the ghosts of former patients still roamed the halls, trapped in a never-ending nightmare of their own creation. But to a group of adventurous teenagers, the hospital represented a thrill they couldn't resist. They gathered in the dark of night, telling each other ghost stories to build up their courage before stepping inside. They had heard of the hospital's dark history, of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. But they were young and foolish, believing they were invincible. The group of 5 entered the hospital, their flashlights barely illuminating the dimly lit hallways. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay, and each step they took echoed through the empty corridors. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching them with its invisible eyes. They explored room after room, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust covering the floor. They found old medical equipment, rusted beds, and broken furniture, all signs of a place that had been abandoned for far too long. But as they moved deeper into the hospital, the atmosphere grew darker, and the air grew colder. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one filled with fear and uncertainty. Then they heard it, a low growl coming from one of the rooms down the hall. They froze, unsure of what to do. Was it a wild animal that had somehow made its way into the hospital? Or was it something far more sinister? They crept towards the room, their flashlights trained on the door. They pushed it open, and the source of the noise was revealed. In the center of the room stood a figure, hunched over and growling like a wild animal. It was dressed in tattered clothing, its hair wild and unkempt. The teenagers stood frozen in terror, unsure of what to do. But then the figure stood up, revealing its face to the light. It was a former patient of the hospital, his eyes wild and filled with rage. He lunged at the group, his hands clawing at their flesh. They ran, screaming in terror as they tried to find their way out of the hospital. But the former patient was relentless, chasing them through the dark halls, his crazed laughter echoing in their ears. Finally, they found the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. They were trapped, with no way out. The former patient caught up to them, his twisted smile filling them with dread. He spoke in a voice that was both haunting and familiar. "You can't leave," he said, his eyes gleaming with madness. "You're all mine now." The group was never seen again, and the hospital remained abandoned. But to those who knew its secrets, it was more than just an empty building. It was a place of terror, a reminder of the dark and twisted past that lay buried beneath its walls. And to those who were brave enough to enter, it was a warning to never underestimate the power of the human mind.
Deep in the heart of a dense forest, there stood an old, abandoned house. It was a large, imposing structure, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the walls a mottled gray. The front door hung crookedly from its hinges, creaking in the wind. To anyone passing by, it would seem that the house had been deserted for years. But there were some who knew the truth. There were those who whispered of strange noises coming from the old house, of ghostly apparitions that could be seen flitting through the windows at night. Some said that the house was cursed, that those who entered would never return. Others believed that the house was haunted by the spirits of those who had died there long ago. Despite the rumors, a group of curious teenagers decided to explore the old house. They had heard the stories, but they were sure that there was nothing to fear. They entered the house cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. The air was musty and thick, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. As they explored the first floor, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The furniture was covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But when they ventured up to the second floor, things began to get strange. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with the smell of mold. As they crept down the hallway, they heard a faint scratching noise coming from one of the rooms. They paused for a moment, their hearts racing, before cautiously pushing open the door. Inside, they found a room unlike any they had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the peeling wallpaper in what appeared to be dried blood. The room was bare, except for a single, wooden chair in the center. The scratching noise continued, growing louder and more urgent. One of the teenagers, a boy named Tom, approached the chair. As he drew closer, he saw that there was something on the seat. It was a small, battered doll with a single button eye and a frayed dress. As he picked it up, the scratching noise grew louder and more frantic. Suddenly, the doll sprang to life in his hand, its remaining eye glowing red. It let out a high-pitched shriek, and the room was plunged into darkness. The teenagers stumbled backwards, tripping over one another as they tried to flee. They made their way back down to the first floor, but as they reached the front door, they found that it was blocked by a strange, glowing mist. The scratching noise continued, growing louder and more insistent. The teenagers huddled together, terrified, as the mist began to close in around them. In the darkness, they heard a voice. It was a soft, feminine voice, speaking in a language that they did not understand. The scratching noise grew louder and more insistent, until suddenly, the mist dissipated. The teenagers were shaken but unharmed. They fled from the house, never looking back. They later learned that the house had once belonged to a woman accused of practicing witchcraft. She had been burned at the stake, but some believed that her spirit had never left the house. Years later, the house still stood, its secrets locked away behind its crumbling walls. Some claimed that they could still hear the scratching noise at night, a haunting reminder of the horrors that lay hidden within the abandoned house. Despite the terrifying experience they had at the abandoned house, the group of teenagers could not help but feel a sense of curiosity about what had happened to them. They began to research the history of the house and the woman who had lived there. They discovered that her name was Isadora Blackwood, and she had been accused of practicing dark magic and consorting with the devil. Isadora had lived alone in the house for many years, shunned by the townspeople who feared and mistrusted her. It was said that she spent her days studying ancient tomes of forbidden knowledge and conducting strange rituals in her attic. As the teenagers delved deeper into Isadora's history, they began to experience strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own, and they heard whispers in the darkness. One night, as they sat in their local diner discussing their findings, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from outside. They rushed out to investigate and found a man lying on the ground, his throat ripped out. The group began to fear that they had awakened something dark and malevolent. They knew they had to find a way to put an end to it before it was too late. They decided to return to the abandoned house, armed with research and a plan. They made their way through the crumbling rooms, following the trail of strange symbols that Isadora had left behind. Finally, they reached the attic. The room was dark and filled with an eerie silence. They could feel a presence there, watching them. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles they had brought with them. In the darkness, they heard a soft voice. "Who dares to disturb my rest?" It was Isadora's voice, and it was filled with anger and malice. The group tried to explain their purpose, but Isadora would not listen. She lashed out at them with her powers, throwing objects at them and filling the room with a cold, evil energy. But the teenagers had a plan. They had brought with them a spell book that they had found in their research. They began to chant the words, their voices growing louder and stronger as they called upon the forces of light to banish the darkness. As they chanted, the room grew brighter and warmer. The cold, evil energy dissipated, and Isadora's ghostly form began to fade away. Finally, she was gone, and the room was filled with a sense of peace. The teenagers emerged from the abandoned house, exhausted but victorious. They knew that they had put an end to the evil that had haunted the house for so long. As they made their way back to town, they heard a voice behind them. "Thank you," it whispered. "You have given me peace at last." They turned around but saw nothing. They knew that Isadora's spirit had finally been laid to rest, and the abandoned house would be haunted no more.
There was once a young couple named Sarah and Michael, who lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. They were happy and in love, but one day, things started to change. Michael began acting strange. He would become moody and distant, and Sarah could not understand what was wrong. She tried to talk to him, but he would brush her off, saying that he was just tired. One night, as Sarah was lying in bed, she heard a noise coming from the basement. She cautiously made her way down the stairs and was met with a chilling sight. Michael was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by candles, muttering to himself in a language that she did not understand. Sarah was scared and confronted Michael about what was going on. He turned to her with a cold, blank expression and told her that he had been possessed by a demon. Sarah didn't believe him and thought that he was just going through a rough patch, but as the days went by, Michael's behavior became more erratic and violent. One night, Sarah was awakened by the sound of glass breaking. She ran downstairs to find Michael standing in the living room, surrounded by broken vases and overturned furniture. He turned to her with eyes that were black and empty, and Sarah knew that this was not the man she loved. Sarah tried to escape, but the demon inside Michael was too strong. It chased her through the house, and Sarah knew that she had to find a way to defeat the demon before it was too late. She remembered a book that her grandmother had given her, filled with spells and incantations for banishing evil spirits. With the book in hand, Sarah confronted Michael and the demon inside him. She recited the incantation and, to her amazement, the demon was expelled from Michael's body. Michael fell to the ground, unconscious, and Sarah knew that he would be okay. From that day on, Sarah and Michael were never the same. They left the house and never spoke of the events that had transpired there. The house still stands on the outskirts of town, and many say that it is haunted by the demon that once possessed Michael. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the sound of glass breaking and Sarah's voice reciting the incantation to banish the demon.
Once upon a time, there was a small village nestled deep in the heart of a dense forest. The village was home to a close-knit community of people who had lived there for generations, passing down their traditions and folklore from one generation to the next. As the sun set each day, the villagers would gather around the fire and share stories of their ancestors and the legends of the forest. One of the most terrifying legends was the tale of the haunted house on the outskirts of the village. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and its windows were boarded up, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. It was said that strange things happened in the house at night, and that anyone who dared to venture inside would never return. Despite the warnings of the elders, a group of curious young villagers decided to explore the haunted house. They gathered at the edge of the forest, their hearts pounding with fear and excitement. As they made their way through the overgrown garden and up the creaky stairs, they felt a sense of unease settle over them. As they entered the house, they were struck by the musty smell of damp wood and rotting fabric. Cobwebs clung to the walls, and the floorboards groaned beneath their feet. They explored the dusty rooms, peering into the dark corners and searching for any signs of the supernatural. As they were about to leave, one of the villagers stumbled upon a hidden door. It creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the depths of the house. With a sense of trepidation, the group descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing eerily on the stone steps. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a dank, musty cellar. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and the only light came from a small, flickering lantern. As they searched the room, they heard a strange noise coming from the darkness beyond. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound, like something scurrying across the floor. But as the noise grew louder, they realized that it was something much more sinister. It sounded like the scraping of claws against stone, and the villagers felt a chill run down their spines. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, fixated on the group. The villagers froze, unable to move as the eyes slowly advanced towards them. They could hear the sound of heavy breathing and a low growling noise that filled the air. Just as the creature was about to pounce, the group heard a loud crash from above. The creature paused, its attention diverted, and the group seized the opportunity to flee. They scrambled up the stairs, their hearts pounding with fear as they burst out into the moonlit night. As they looked back at the house, they saw the silhouette of a massive creature framed in the window. It was a hulking, shadowy figure, with sharp claws and glowing eyes that seemed to follow them as they ran. The villagers never spoke of their experience again, but the legend of the haunted house grew even stronger. Over time, people whispered that the creature was a demon, summoned by an ancient curse that had been placed upon the house. They said that it prowled the forest at night, searching for unsuspecting victims to drag down into the depths of the haunted house. As the years passed, the village changed. New houses were built, and the old traditions slowly began to fade away. But the legend of the haunted house remained, a reminder of the darkness that lurked in the shadows of the forest. And to this day, the villagers still tell stories of the creature that roams the forest, waiting for its next victim to venture too deep into the woods. But there was one young girl in the village who was particularly fascinated by the legend of the haunted house. Her name was Emily, and she was always eager to hear the tales of the supernatural that the elders told by the fire. Despite her parents' warnings, Emily often wandered into the forest on her own, searching for clues that might lead her to the haunted house. She would follow the winding paths through the trees, listening for any sound that might hint at the presence of the creature that haunted her dreams. One day, as Emily was exploring the forest, she stumbled upon an old, rusted key. It was lying in the underbrush, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. Emily felt a thrill of excitement course through her veins as she picked up the key, wondering if it might be the key to the haunted house. That night, Emily snuck out of her house and made her way to the edge of the forest, clutching the key tightly in her hand. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears as she approached the dark, looming shape of the haunted house. The door creaked open easily under the weight of the old key, and Emily stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and decay, and she could feel the cold chill of the damp stone seeping into her bones. As she made her way through the abandoned rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Just as Emily was about to turn back, she heard a strange noise coming from the cellar. It sounded like the scraping of claws against stone, and the low growling noise that the villagers had described so many years ago. Emily's heart was pounding with fear, but she felt a strange sense of curiosity drawing her towards the sound. As she descended the stairs, the air grew colder and the darkness thickened. She could hear the sound of heavy breathing and the rustling of movement coming from the shadows. And then she saw the glowing eyes, fixated on her in the darkness. Emily froze, unable to move as the creature advanced towards her. Its eyes were like fiery coals, and its claws were long and sharp. She could feel its hot breath on her skin, and she knew that she was trapped. But then, just as the creature was about to pounce, Emily heard a sound from above. It was a soft, tinkling melody, like the sound of a music box. The creature paused, distracted by the sound, and Emily seized the opportunity to flee. As she stumbled up the stairs, she heard the creature's angry growl echoing through the darkness. But she didn't stop until she had burst out into the moonlit night, the haunted house behind her. From that day on, Emily never forgot the terror of the haunted house. But she also never forgot the sweet sound of the music box that had saved her life. She often wondered who had played it, and what secrets lay hidden within the walls of the haunted house.